Special envoy Hans Grunberg concludes the first week of consultations over a new framework in Yemen. The United Nations says that dozens of Yemeni children have been killed or maimed in 2022. Arab Interior Ministers unanimously approved to designate Houthi militia as a terrorist group. Welcome to Yemen Today TV. This is the English news with me, Roshan Fouad. The United Nations Special Envoy Hans Grunberg has concluded the first week of intensive consultations with Yemeni delegates in Amman over his proposed new framework. The delegates represent a diverse spectrum of Yemeni political parties, civil society, and women. The following report has more details on this.
The Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Yemen, Hans Grunberg, had a meeting with leaders from the General People's Congress and representatives from Al-Islah Party and the Nasrist Unionist People's Organization to discuss ideas for his framework, including a multi-track process that aims to chart a path towards a sustainable political settlement to the conflict. This meeting is held due to the current armed conflict that has been continuing for over 7 years. Civilians, including so many children, have been killed, displaced, and impoverished. Civilian infrastructure has been targeted. Armed actors have been detained, abducted, and forcibly disappeared people with impunity. The Special Envoy, as a result, explained the intent of the consultations was to gather in an honest and frank way ideas, views, and suggestions for an immediate and long-term priorities for the political security and economic tracks. He stressed on the importance of engaging with multiple Yemeni groups in consultations, so that the framework is informed by diverse voices. All participants welcomed the consultations and expressed support for the Special Envoy's efforts. A range of issues were raised by the participants regarding the agenda and priorities of the three tracks, the guiding principles for the political process, and issues related to process design. Participants highlighted the need for a ceasefire and the urgency of returning to negotiations and resuming the peace process. Some of the key points raised during the first week of discussions focused also on the need to address the plight and common challenges facing all Yemenis, including the humanitarian situation and alarming living conditions of civilians across the country, and the need to address a fractured economy. The Special Envoy will continue his planned bilateral consultations with other parties and stakeholders in the coming weeks. Next week, we are looking forward to his meeting in Amman with the representatives of the Southern Transitional Council, the Inclusive Hadramaut Conference, the General People's Congress security and economic experts, and civil society.
UNICEF stated that children in Yemen are not starving due to food scarcity, but because their families cannot afford food. They added that the impact of the economic collapse on the humanitarian crisis in Yemen cannot be understated. The organization also said without urgent action, millions could be plunged into famine. Vulnerable children bear the brunt of wars. A recent UN report has warned that dozens of Yemeni children have been killed or maimed only during the past 2 months. Death by airstrikes or Houthi militia shelling makes no difference. The following report has more details.
About 47 children have been killed in Yemen's civil war in January and February, according to the UNICEF. Children are the first and most to suffer. The UN's Children's Fund said that more than 10,000 minors have been killed or injured in a war that has raged since 2015. Just over the first 2 months of this year, 47 children were reportedly killed or maimed in several locations across Yemen, said the UNICEF representative to Yemen. Since the conflict escalated in Yemen nearly 7 years ago, the UN verified that more than 10,200 children have been killed. The actual number is likely much higher. Hundreds of thousands of people have died as direct or indirect consequences of Yemen's war. The conflict has caused a collapse in basic services such as healthcare and education, with millions of people displaced and 80% of the population are dependent on aid. A report released by the UN Security Council in January said nearly 2,000 children recruited by the rebels had died on the battlefield between January 2020 and May. The militia's targeting of children was not limited to intimidating them, but also targeted their schools, either by destroying them or forcing them to replace school pens with Kalashnikovs after they brainwashed their cycles and exposed them to scenes of killing and violence. The Human Rights Report monitored the Houthi recruitment of 1,748 children and pushed them to the front lines. Making children pay the bill of Houthis' actions is not acceptable, and there should be actions taken from the international community's side as fast as possible.
Houthi mines continue to chase lives of innocent children, especially in the west coast of Hodeidah. Landmines have been planted randomly in heavily populated areas. This has increased the number of casualties among people, especially children. The FUNG report includes one of those dreadful stories of children maimed by mines.
In an embodiment of the human tragedy in Yemen, which is entering its 8th year as the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, according to the United Nations, Ra'ed Dahmash tells us his story, which is one of the thousands of landmine victims in Yemen. The child Ra'ed, aged 12 years, who is sitting on a chair that accompanies him most of the time, told Yemen Today that he was going on his way back from tending sheep with his 3 colleagues, and a landmine exploded, leading to an injury in his leg. His right hand and left hand, in addition to his left leg, were damaged, noting that all his colleagues were not hurt because they were standing in another place.
My colleagues and I were herding sheep in the afternoon. Then on our way home, a landmine exploded and all my limbs were affected, and one leg was amputated. I call for providing me a prosthetic leg so that I can return to my school. And I call for removing mines from residential and agricultural areas.
Ra'ed, a student in elementary school, added that the suffering seasons are like a snowball, but it doesn't melt, but rather increase in size as it rolls. He also stressed that care for livestock in desert areas is very hard and tiring work amid the dangers of landmines. The child also added that he still remembers the fear and warnings of his parents, who are older than him, about mines. Ra'ed lives with his family of 7 people in the isolation of Beni Fayed in Hajjah, northwest of Yemen. His older brother Ali called on the authorities to provide a prosthetic leg for his brother to return to his school and to his natural life. He noted that his family cannot provide a prosthetic leg for his brother as a result of the deteriorating economic situation of his family.
He was herding sheep and the mine exploded on him, leaving him without a leg. We call on authorities to help him so he could finish his studies. We also hope for doubling efforts to clear mines because we are heavily affected by it.
In northwest Yemen, most children tend to livestock to help their parents amid the challenges and dangers of landmines. Most of the children who work in livestock travel distance of more than 6 square kilometers. There were also material losses that amounted to the death of about 27 camels and more than 44 sheep, in addition to the sustained losses in the agricultural sector, which prevented farmers from reaching their agricultural lands as a result of the mines scattered randomly in fields and farms.
The German Bertelsmann Foundation confirmed that the Houthis cannot keep peace or maintain law in Yemen. The foundation further mentioned that the militia is collecting revenues through imposed taxes, extortion, kidnapping, confiscation, and looting of humanitarian aid to finance its networks and supporters. A human rights report documents 1,534 violations against civilians in Taiz. The Information and Rehabilitation Center for Human Rights said that civilians were killed as a result of the militia's direct targeting with heavy and medium shells, which fall almost daily on most neighborhoods and residential areas in the city of Taiz. Government agencies seized a shipment of thermal missiles coming from Oman on its way to the Houthi militia. The sources indicated that 54 thermal missiles were seized inside electric generators. where they were emptied from the operating machines and stuffed with the seized thermal missile parts. The General Secretary of the Council of Arab Interior Ministers has approved the classification of the Houthi militia as a terrorist group. This comes as a result of the violations the Houthi militia committed against the Yemeni population, including killing, displacement, imprisonment, and torture. According to their statement, the militia conducted repeated cross-border terrorist attacks targeting civilians and infrastructure in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. The negligence of the Yemeni government exacerbates the suffering of wounded government forces abroad. Suffering of wounded aggravated as a result of ignoring their repeated calls to complete their necessary treatment and not responding to their demands by the legitimate government. The tragedies and suffering of the wounded multiply not only because of the physical complications, but also it has psychological effects that add to their pain. The Houthi militia confronted intensified battles south of Ma'rib. According to military sources, violent battles between the government forces and the militia erupted after attack attempts by the militia on the eastern Balak front. The source confirmed the government forces and tribes thwarted these Houthi attempts and forced them to retreat and flee, coinciding with focused artillery bombardment targeting militia sites and gatherings. The battles and shelling resulted in the killing and wounding of dozens of Houthi militia members and the destruction of a weapons depot and many crews and vehicles. The various fighting fronts in the vicinity of Ma'rib are witnessing violent battles between the two sides, during which the militia suffers heavy losses in equipment and lives. Coming next. In Aden, Nushad is a story of an old Yemeni who has been stricken by the war and disability.
راتب الواحد 120 ألف والكيس الدقيق ب18,000 والكيس السكر اليوم ب20,000. كم يعني بيعطي هذا الراتب كامل كيس سكر وكيس دقيق؟
المواطن اليمني يعيش في أزمة إنسانية وغذائية مؤلمة من غلاء الأسعار وفحشة الأسعار وغلاء الصرف والعملة الأجنبية في البلد.
حالتي الحين حالة لما خرج لما ندي 12 كيلو ما نقدرش ناكل الأكل داخل ما احنا بحاجة صعبة.
Welcome back. The war has overshadowed all aspects of life and hit heavily on people, especially elders and children. Nushad is an example of many other Yemenis who have been stricken by the conflict and hard living conditions as well. The Fouad report has more details on this.
Nushad, an elderly Yemeni citizen who retired after becoming paralyzed, fights tooth and nail for his survival in the corner of Mualla Street in Aden. Nushad sells potatoes, samosas, and bhaji to make enough money to buy medicine and secure a decent life for his family.
My name is Nushad Ibrahim Al-Tahir Uthman. I started working in a factory on November 13, 1973. After I quit working there, I started working in a Chinese restaurant where the owner was very generous and helpful towards me. Things started getting worse after the war began. I told my sister-in-law I could start selling her sambusa, and that's how I started my own business.
He only has himself to rely on to provide an income to sustain his family and improve his living situation, in spite of his paralysis and old age.
Brother Nushad here is disabled, and his situation is quite dire. He is retired and his salary is very low. He sells samosas in order to survive.
Nushad suffers from high blood pressure, but he can't afford treatment, since the pension doesn't cover the insane rise in the price of medicines and food. In addition, the delay in monthly salaries has put a strain on his household's financial situation.
Nushad is a hard-working man who relies on his limited salary to feed his family and provide medication for himself. He is self-reliant and he never asks for help. I call on humanitarian organizations to help ease his living situations and to support disabled people.
Nushed, like many other Yemenis in the wake of the war, awaits the intervention of charitable organizations to ease his suffering and provide him with basic life necessities.
Houthi militia has lowered internet service quality in most regions of the country. Internet service is almost completely out of service in most of the liberated areas and areas under the Houthi control. A number of media professionals and activists and pioneers of social networking sites confirmed to witness a severe weakness in the internet service. Houthi militia continues to use telecommunications for military purposes, having a total control over the service every now and then. The rebels create technical failures just to add to the troubles of people. The following report has more details.
Around 27% of Yemenis have access to the internet, which is regularly the target of military operations by both sides in the conflict. After Saudi-led coalition airstrikes hit a telecommunications infrastructure in Hodeidah late January, Yemen was cut off from the internet. The sector is being targeted as part of an economic warfare strategy because it's a source of cash for the Houthis. During the early years of the conflict, Houthis were responsible for breaking the key Falcon internet cable while digging military fortifications around Hodeidah. The same cable was destroyed by a ship's anchor in Egypt in January 2020, cutting Yemen off from the internet for weeks. As Yemen faces an extreme humanitarian crisis where 5 million people are on the brink of famine and continued daily casualties from the war, it's very important to depoliticize the telecom sector and make rapid progress in expanding affordable access to facilitate humanitarian assistance, economic activity, and normal civilian life. Millions of Yemenis are living through the civil war without access to information, contact with family, or online banking services. Yemenis lost access to internet companies, news, education, and social networks, as well as remittance from family abroad during these blackouts. The poor telecom service in Yemen is largely due to the failures of successive governments compounded by the war, which has been ongoing since 2014. Aside from the direct damage it has caused to infrastructure, the instability has discouraged private investment in the sector. The good news is that there is opportunities for improving internet access in Yemen, but these require political will and serious investment. Internet and telecommunications sectors should be a priority for the peace process. The internet is a basic human right, and improving access would be a win for all Yemenis. It's time to pay more attention to this sector before Yemenis are pushed further into the darkness.
Traffic stopped in the capital of Hadramaut due to a protest against the rise in fuel prices. Cars prevented heavy trucks from crossing the city streets in a peaceful protest rejecting the exaggerated price of fuel. The citizens of Hadramaut witnessed an increase in the price of a liter of gasoline to 1,320 riyals, which sparked widespread popular anger. Diaspora writings is one main important genre in literature. It is when the migrant writer undergoes a cultural and psychological shock in his or her newly chosen country. Thuraya al-Muntasir is a young American Yemeni poet who has recollected her experience of physical and emotional alienation and retold them into a collection of poems entitled The Wild Fox of Yemen. This report looks with more depth into this.
The 7-year-long war has left Yemen in shambles and its people starving to death. According to the UN, it is presently one of the world's biggest humanitarian crises, and no one appears to be willing or able to do anything to stop it. In her collection of poems, The Wild Fox of Yemen, which came out last year, Thuraya al-Muntasir openly relays her experience navigating various aspects of her identity. The struggle to make her place in the United States, the ruin of her parents' homeland and culture, and the potentially crushing sense of hopelessness. Her poems offer a glimpse into a unique reality that is shared by many immigrant children, addressing the perplexity of merging cultures, the feeling of belonging, but not quite. Al-Muntasir has done an outstanding job of demonstrating that while life can sometimes be challenging, it can also be a reservoir of beauty and strength. Yemen plays a significant role in this compilation, deeply influencing Al-Muntasir's works both in scenery and in spirit. We hear the cultures great in discordance and echo as they collide. Even the language she uses in her poetry portrays the collision of civilizations, with Arabic letters unexpectedly dispersed mid-poem. To monolinguists, the sudden appearance of a new script among familiar alphabets appears exotic and unique. It is, however, Al-Muntasir's reality. Arabic and English are what help identify her shield, and the target on her back. Living in the US and being of a certain skin tone brands you as different, places you under constant scrutiny. In the poem Home Security After 9/11, Al-Muntasir emphasizes this sense of uncertainty and terror. However, her poetry doesn't simply abide by the themes of isolation. There are poems that embrace the distinctions between who she is and where she came from, poems that highlight the magic and mystery of Yemen, poems that honor personal and cultural history, and poems that simply inspire awe.
Here's a reminder of the main headlines. Special Envoy Hans Grunberg concludes the first week of consultations over new framework in Amman. The United Nations says that dozens of Yemeni children have been killed or maimed in 2022. Arab interior ministers approved to designate Houthi militia as a terrorist group. This is the end of the news. For more, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube at Yemen Today English. This is Roshan Fouad. Thank you for watching.